Hi everybody, Pete Sartes for The Lawyer You Know. As promised, today we are going to go through the United States Sentencing Guideline calculation for Elizabeth Holmes, and I'm going to try to give you a perspective of how a sentence is formulated for a specific defendant in federal court. Now, before we do that, as always, if you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're liking the series, please subscribe to our channel. And as always, please leave me questions and comments below, especially if there are any other legal topics that you find interesting, so we can determine what next series we're going to do for you. That being said, let's take a little step back into the last couple episodes that we did. Elizabeth Holmes is going to be sentenced by the federal judge in California in September. The reason it's taking so long is because this is such a big case and there's so much evidence involved and it's complicated. The judge, I think, wanted to make sure that he gave everybody enough time to properly prepare for sentencing. With that, what's going to happen is the Federal Probation Office is going to produce an advisory guideline calculation that's going to be presented to both the prosecutor and the defense for their commentary. Once those comments are received, the final report will be prepared, and once that happens, the judge will get a copy in order to consider for sentencing purposes. Now, this is the United States Sentencing Guideline, and it is set up in 6 sections. It's not exactly rocket science, but it is complicated enough where you have to understand how the guidelines work in order to be able to apply the various sections. So that's what I'm going to do for you today. I'm going to give you an idea about what her sentencing guideline looks like, and we're going to talk about some of the sentencing guideline elements that may or may not come into play. So with that, let's start. Elizabeth Holmes is convicted of 4 counts. 1 count of conspiracy and 3 actual substantive counts of fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343. What we do first is we look at the sentencing guideline and determine what the appropriate section is to determine the base offense level for fraud. And just so you know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a sentencing guideline breakdown in this video so that you can actually see all of the elements that I think are going to be calculated, some of the things that may or may not be included, just so you have an idea about what to expect. So, sentencing guideline base offense is 7. And what that means is, and I'll put this up, I hope you can see it, there are offense levels that are listed on the left side of the sentencing guidelines score sheet, and these levels are what determine the appropriate amount of months of imprisonment, probation, whatever the case may be. So we start with a base offense level of 7, but because this is a financial crime, the court has to consider the loss amount. And in this case, what I have heard and what I've seen is that the loss amount looks like it's $950 million. So what you need to do is you go to the book and you look at where the loss amount calculation is. And in this set of circumstances, if the loss amount is in excess of $500 million, you add 30 points to the sentencing guideline calculation. So now we have base offense level 7. We have the loss amount of over $500 million. So 37 is where we are now. Next. There is also a section that determines the amount of victims. We call it the victim impact. And if the prosecution has proven that there were more than 10 victims, you add 2 additional points to that calculation. Now, if a financial hardship occurs to more than 5 people, there's an additional 4 points that can be added. If a substantial financial harm happened to more than 25 people, you add 6 points. I will share with you, I think there's going to be a fight here with what substantial harm, financial harm actually is. Remember, there are no banks that lost money here. This was not a public company yet, so there are not a lot of individual shareholders. This is still venture capital, meaning that everybody that invested should have been something known as an accredited investor, meaning that they have more than $1 million in order to be able to invest in these types of investments. With that being said, I think there's going to be a lot of fight whether or not anybody has a substantial loss, financial harm. So we shall see how that goes. But for our purposes, I did not score either 4 or 6 points. I left that aside. We'll see how that comes together. In addition, one other section that I'm think is going to be a matter of controversy is whether or not there was a risk of substantial bodily harm, a risk of serious bodily harm. I can see the government making the argument, and potentially probation making the argument, that because of the Edison machine's purpose to test the blood, to come up with results to help people determine what medications they should take or what medical procedures they should undergo, I believe there's a possibility that the government and the probation officer are going to score 2 additional points for the risk of serious bodily injury. I would guess that the defense is going to argue that that should not apply since all of the counts involving patients were not guilties. So at this point, we'll see how that comes together. Again, I will put it on the list as a possible score, but I'm not going to add it to my calculation for Elizabeth Holmes' sentencing calculation. All right, so next, you look at the conspiracy count. The conspiracy count is scored under a section 2X1.1, and it basically says you group that with the substantive count of conviction, so we don't have to do a separate calculation just for the conspiracy. It is the same calculation as with the fraud counts. All right, the next thing we need to do is this. Determine whether or not these counts are going to be concurrent or consecutive sentences. And we've had this discussion in the past, and what I will tell you is the sentencing guidelines indicates that if the counts of conviction are part of the same course of conduct, a continuation of a particular criminal enterprise or scheme, then those are grouped together. So again, even though she has 4 counts of conviction, 3 mistries, and 4 acquittals, all of the sentences are going to be presented as one amount of actual time of months imprisonment. Next, let's talk about the adjustments. The next section in the sentencing guidelines talks about variations that are relevant to the specific characteristics of the offender. So the first one I went to was whether or not the defendant knew that the victims of the case were particularly vulnerable. The guidelines calls for 2 additional points to be added if there's a vulnerable victim. I have not scored vulnerable victim. And the reason that I didn't score it is because, from my perspective, because the patients have been acquitted, the victims of this particular crime are all the investors. All of these investors are accredited investors. Let's be honest, are all millionaires, multimillionaires, billionaires. So I do not perceive these people as vulnerable. They should be sophisticated and astute investors. So I am not going to add those 2 points. I'll bet you're going to see a little bit of controversy in that section also. 3B1.1, the next section, talks about the role that the specific defendant played in the fraud or in the scheme. I believe that Elizabeth Holmes is going to eat herself 4 points. Why? Because I believe she is a leader and organizer, which calls for 4 additional points. There is a lesser included role adjustment for managers, but I don't think technically Elizabeth Holmes is in that section because she is in fact the CEO of the company and she is the founder of the company. Therefore, from my perspective, she is the leader of the organization. So I'm going to add 4 points to her sentencing score. The next section in the sentencing guideline discusses the use of a special skill or the abuse of trust. What this basically means is, did the person that committed the crime abuse a specific position that they held, normally doctor, lawyer, some profession, broker, something like that, or does she have a special skill? I did a little bit of research, and the research says that in order to be accountable for a special skill adjustment, you don't have to have a special skill like a license or something that you learn in school. It is okay to score someone based on a special skill that they have acquired based on their own abilities. And I believe that is the clincher where the probation officer is going to add 2 additional points to her score as an abuse of trust or special skill, because let's be real, she left an Ivy League school in order to develop this amazing machine, and this whole process was built upon her technology and her idea. So from my perspective, she gets 2 points for the use of a special skill. Another area that I believe is going to be a point of controversy is whether or not Elizabeth Holmes participated in any obstruction of justice? I think the answer is yes. The sentencing guidelines calls for 2 levels upward adjustment for obstruction of justice. And let's talk about why I think obstruction of justice qualifies. Obstruction of justice qualifies if a defendant has committed perjury, has intimidated a witness, or destroyed material evidence. Based on the evidence that was presented during the trial, we know at least 2 of these things are true. Number 1, we know that the database of all of the documentation at Theranos was purged at some point. Thankfully, other former employees had made copies and made backups of those documents, or there wouldn't be any documents to have. Now, did that happen because it was part of the corporate policy, or did it happen because Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani possibly made a determination that these documents were no longer in their benefit, so they wanted to get rid of them? That's for the court to determine. But from my perspective, that is one of the things that there was testimony about. The second thing, if you remember, there was a young gal that received very threatening emails from lawyers telling her that she has an agreement with the company. She's bound to confidentiality. She should not talk to anyone, including the media, about Theranos. If you recall, she was served by process server at her car in the parking lot of her new job at some ridiculous hour of the night. I believe that that is enough to justify either one of those acts. Either the destruction of the documents or the potential intimidation of that witness is enough to add the additional 2 points. So for my calculation, I'm going to add it. I promise you the defense is going to be adamant that none of these should apply. I presume the government and the probation office are going to disagree, but we'll see how that plays out. I'm going to score it for our purposes now. Criminal history. Criminal history is a big part of the sentencing guidelines because someone that has a substantial criminal background is going to be subject to enhanced penalty as opposed to someone who is a first offender. Now, from everything that I've heard and everything that I've read, Elizabeth Holmes does not have a criminal history. She has never been convicted of a felony. She doesn't have any crimes of moral turpitude in her past. There is no conviction that would qualify for an additional criminal history enhancement. So for our purposes, I'm going to stick with criminal history category number 1, which means no points. So with that, what is our total guideline score? In my opinion, it is 7, base offense level, 30, financial loss, 2 points for 10 or more victims, 4 points for leader organizer, and 2 points for obstruction of justice, and 2 points for abuse of trust. That's a level 47. So, a level 47. What does that mean? That's a problem, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll tell you why that's a problem. Because if you look at the bottom of the sentencing guideline chart, you will see that the sentencing guideline ends at level 43, which has a presumptive reasonable sentence of life in prison. But wait, is Elizabeth Holmes going to get life in prison? No. And I'll tell you why. Because the statutory maximum prison sentence allowable under the charges that were brought against her and the charges she was convicted of is 20 years. Therefore, no matter what the sentencing guideline says, the statutory maximum sentence is 20 years. So for our purposes now, let's use the statutory maximum as 20 years as the cap for her potential sentence. The next thing that you have to do in the calculation is determine whether or not someone is eligible for probation or some sort of alternative sentence. I'll show you that there are 4 zones on the chart. Zone A presumes no incarceration. Zone B and C presume a split sentence of some sort, either community control, meaning that you are under house arrest, or some sort of home detention, or something like you go to the county jail and then you go home on the weekends, things like that. It's not till you get to Zone C where there is a possibility of actually going to prison, meaning a part of your sentence will be prison, a part will be probation. And in Zone D, the presumption from the guidelines is that you will serve the amount of your sentence in a federal prison, where we'll talk about the different federal prisons that are available for different classifications of offenders and people of different genders. I'll go through that in a different video. But for now, understand the way Elizabeth Holmes scores, based on what I've just done, she's going to prison. It is not going to be a Martha Stewart type of event where she spends some time sitting in a jail and then some time sitting at home, under house arrest. It is going to be a legitimate years of prison sentence. All right. As part of the determination of her sentence, there has to be a calculation about whether or not she is going to be on something called supervised release when she's released from prison. And the answer is yes. And here's what happens. The sentencing guideline refers back to the federal statutes that talk about the different classifications of felonies. And this is a felony, so let's just focus on that for now. There are Class A, B, and C felonies, and what they say is depending on what class you are will dictate how much what in state court is known as probation. We call it supervised release in federal court. A person will have to serve after they're released. For our purposes, for a Class C felony, which is what Elizabeth Holmes has been convicted of, the maximum amount of supervised release that she can serve after she's released from prison is 3 years. So we add that as part of her overall sentencing package. What does supervised release actually mean? It means that you're under the supervision of the probation department again. And some of the mandatory requirements are things like you can't commit another crime, community service. There is a special assessment of $100 per count of conviction, so $400 added to the fine or the restitution amount, which we'll talk about here in a second. There are also discretionary terms that the court can place upon a defendant. For example, determine where she's allowed to live, whether she has a full-time job, requiring probation to be allowed to visit her anytime they want, whenever they want, any time of day or night. DNA sampling, no drugs or alcohol, now not being allowed to leave the federal district in which she is supervised without prior approval. To say the least, there are some others, but that's pretty much the ones what I would expect are going to be part of Elizabeth Holmes' sentence for her supervised release. So, next section talks about restitution. Let's define restitution for a second. Restitution is the defendant's requirement to make whole any defendants who have lost money. That's what it is. Technically, that make them whole is a hard number, meaning if they lost $1, the defendant has to pay back $1. It does not count things like pain and suffering. It does not count mental anguish, nothing like that. It has to be a financially determinable number, and it has to be correlated to an actual amount of loss. So Elizabeth Holmes is going to be ordered to pay, at least at this point, a number, let's just say around $950 million. Is she going to pay $950 million back to these investors? No. Why? Because one of the things that the guidelines discusses is the defendant's ability to pay that debt. The United States does not have something that was known in common law as debtor's prison, meaning they can't send you to jail and keep you in prison until you pay back money that you owe. We just don't have that in our legal system. So that is just not something that's going to happen. What the court will do, though, is during the course of her incarceration, any money that she receives in her commissary, meaning like the little bank account you have at the prison, any monies that she makes if she works something called a Unicor job. Unicor is a organization that provides jobs for prisoners. Most of you have heard of, making license plates in prison. Yes, in state prisons, people legitimately make license plates. In federal prisons, there are a lot more jobs. For example, there are construction jobs because prisons are maintained for the most part by the prisoners. There are jobs that are producing furniture. There are jobs that repair vehicles. There are teaching jobs for people to get their GED, things like that. So there will be an opportunity for Elizabeth Holmes to have some sort of a work. And I'll tell you, you may think that most people don't want a job while they're in prison. You'd be wrong. Most people crave a Unicor job because literally it's something to do all day. It gives people purpose as opposed to just sitting in a cell staring at the ceiling all day long. So the courts are allowed to take a portion of that money. And just to be clear, a unicorn job doesn't pay minimum wage. It pays like cents or a few dollars a day. It's literally sustenance. It's designed more for penance than it is for payment. So she will probably have a unicorn job. So the court's going to take money from her commissary account, her unicorn job, and if the $950 million isn't paid off by the time she gets out of prison, the court has 3 years of supervised release where they can obviously take her money when she goes back into the real world and gets a job. After that time, whatever is left over becomes a lien against her. So if at some point she wins the lottery, gets a humongous job, winds up coming to a big pile of money, the government can always come back and take that money from her. I think that that's probably unrealistic at $950 million. The next section talks about something financial outside of just the restitution, and it's a fine. The federal statute that Elizabeth Holmes is convicted of has the possibility of up to a $250,000 fine. Do I think the judge is going to give her a fine on top of the $950 million? Yeah, I think he is. Do I think it's going to be the whole $250,000? Yes, I think it is. Because at this point, let's be realistic. I think that the conviction requires prison. I think that the court is obligated to assess some sort of fine, and the court is going to assess the restitution amount and, of course, the special assessment of $400. After her prison sentence and after her supervised release are concluded, is there anything that the court can do to have some sort of restraint on Elizabeth Holmes? And the answer is yes. The sentencing guidelines calls for things like occupational restrictions. Normally, when someone is convicted of a financial crime, the court will require that they never seek employment in the financial services industry again. So it makes sense. If it's Medicare or Medicaid fraud, it's a physician, the court may order that that person can never be eligible for Medicare or Medicaid again. Things like that. So I anticipate that in this sentence that Judge Davila is going to impose on Elizabeth Holmes, after the prison term is concluded, after she has her fine and her special assessments and her restitution amount, the court's probably going to say, and you will never work in the financial industry again. There are some things now that the court is going to consider called specific offender characteristics. And these are things that the court is allowed to depart on. And what that means is there are two technical terms. It's a variance and a departure. For our purposes, the distinction is not necessary for our discussion, but it's a way for the judge to either increase the sentence or decrease the sentence based on the specific offense characteristics of the defendant. Now, there are things that are absolutely precluded from being taken into consideration. Physical appearance, addiction, employment history, socioeconomic status, lack of guidance as a youth, age, gender, sexual orientation, all of that doesn't count. You cannot change somebody's sentences because of something that they possess in those categories. But there are things that the court can use to depart that sentence. And some of them are mental and emotional condition. I promise you there's going to be discussion from the defendant about whether or not Elizabeth Holmes' mental or emotional condition is going to be suitable for prison. Is it going to be successful? Doubt it, but I'm sure they're going to raise it. Care of children. Now, does that mean that if you have children and you have to take care of your kids that you can't go to prison? Absolutely not. What it means is if there are extraordinary circumstances, and let me define that better for you in an example. If you have a child that has significant special needs that requires a specific parent because that parent either is necessary for the child, has a special ability, or the child will somehow suffer a greater harm other than my parent is going to prison, that can be taken into consideration. I don't think Elizabeth Holmes qualifies for any of these, but I will bet you the defense will make an argument that she's a young mother, child. Also why I think the judge waited till September to have this sentencing. Breastfeeding should be done by then. Child's gonna be over a year old. So we'll see how that comes together, but I don't think we're gonna see any of those adjustments. Financial support. If the defendant is financially responsible for a large number of people. Again, I don't think that's going to be taken into consideration in this particular sentencing because I don't think Elizabeth Holmes financially supports anyone at this point. Military, civic, or charitable works. Normally, these are not readily used unless somebody has atypical service. I'll give you the best example, I think, from a military perspective. Just because you've been in the military does not mean you get special treatment at sentencing. If you received the Medal of Honor, or if you acted somehow gallantly and saved people beyond the call of duty, can the court take that into consideration? Absolutely. Just because you give money to charity doesn't mean that it affects your sentence. Now, if you have started multiple charities and used your own legitimate money to fund those charities and you've gone above and beyond helping countless people, the court can consider those acts and use them as a departure. There is also a section in the guidelines called 5K2. That is what I call the catch-all. The court's given the latitude to say, and if there's anything else that we have not anticipated that exists in the guideline itself, you can take that into consideration, judge, and depart as long as there is a legitimate reason, and you have to put that reason on the record. So if at any point either the government or the defendant appeals, the appellate court knows exactly what you were thinking and why you made the decision to depart either upward or downward. Inside of those departure sections that I think we're going to see that fall under 5K2 are crimes committed while under duress or coercion. You remember that whole Sunny Balwani controlled me. He was the actual person in charge. I was a battered spouse or battered girlfriend, whatever she was. You remember all of that testimony? I think the purpose of that is to raise this specific departure request. Judge, please reduce this unreasonable sentence because it wasn't her fault completely. She was coerced by Sunny Balwani. In addition, I think you're going to see the defense argue something called aberrant behavior or apparent behavior. Aberrant behavior, that's how I pronounce it, means that the crime committed is so out of this person's normal behavior or character that it's a one-off thing. I've seen these types of departures. I've had them in the past. They are really, really rare. I'll give you an example of something that a personal one that I had. There was a defendant who was actually in charge of a union. That defendant wound up stealing money from the union, and nobody would have ever been the wiser. One day, this defendant wakes up, and I don't know if he found the Lord or just found, just came to the realization that what he was doing was wrong. And he goes and self-reports the crime to the union and the government. He pays the money back before the government even charges him. He winds up getting charged for fraud, obviously, but the court determined that, his prison sentence should be significantly reduced because but for him coming forward, but for him notifying everybody of his crime, nobody would have known about it. And he actually paid the money back before the crime was even prosecuted by the government. So again, something totally out of character for him. One-time thing. He felt remorse and got credit for it. There are also departure guidelines available for something called acceptance of responsibility. You will not see that in this case. When you go to trial, the government presumes that you do not accept responsibility. So, do I think that Elizabeth Holmes is going to get a 20-year prison sentence? No. Is it possible? Yes, it is. But I think what you're going to hear in argument is that this sentence of 20 years for the crime committed is unreasonably large because of the loss amount. If her conduct were the exact same, except $50,000 was the loss amount, meaning the amount of money people lost, her sentencing guideline calculation would be far lower than that. She'd probably be somewhere in the 16 or 18 range, which would give her a prison sentence, a recommended sentence of about 21 to 30 months. So the fact that the money is driving the severity of this sentence leads me to believe that the judge, especially in California, which is a relatively liberal jurisdiction, is going to probably be less than that 20 years. Now, what do you think? You tell me. Do you think that she's going to be scored on some of these levels that I didn't calculate? Do you think there are other reasons that you believe her sentence should be either less strenuous or more strenuous, please give me your feedback below and let's talk about it. But beyond that, I will do a video talking about prisons and where she could potentially be sentenced to and how life is for, or will be for, Elizabeth Holmes in prison. And that'll be in a different video. But for now, thank you very much for being with us. We will keep you up to date as things happen, both in the Elizabeth Holmes case as things progress and also Sunny Balwani. But for now, that's all we have. Again, if you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. I know it was a long one. If you are enjoying the series, please subscribe. And as always, questions, comments below. And don't forget to tell me about what other legal topics you're interested in. If I get enough people that tell me the same thing, I'll make sure that we start following that particular legal topic for you. For now, goodbye, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.